Hey, you have Patrick Findaro here, co-founder of Visa Franchise. I'm excited to have on immigration attorney Kripa Upadhyay, based in Seattle, Washington. We've had clients over the years, mostly for the E-2 visa, which will be the focus of today's chat. Thanks a lot for joining, Kripa.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So we've seen together a few different structures and having multiple family members invest in the same E-2 visa business. And there's all different types of ways that one can structure an E-2 visa, which I'd like to go through that, as well as going into source of funds and what someone can really do to set their application up for success. Maybe before we dive into investment structure and source of funds, if you could just give like a primer on the E-2 visa and what you want to see before taking on an E-2 visa client.
Sure. So for me, a lot of our clients it's actually a mix, right? So we have a lot of clients that are born in countries that have treaties with the US, and so they qualify based on the country of birth itself. But then I have now a few clients that were born in countries that do not have the Treaty of Trade and Commerce, but they've taken citizenship, either via residency or investment or residency in another country. So Spain and Portugal, obviously, primary contenders, and then Grenada, very, very popular. So, and I think in terms of the structure, you're also working with immigrants that have a preconceived familiarity, if you will, with certain types. And so there are different, definite lanes that they like to fit into, right? So for some of our investors, we're seeing more of a preference for real estate-based franchises. So your, nursing homes, but also home management, vacation management companies.
Sure.
That's very popular with a certain segment. And then for the other segment, hospitality, right? So a lot of food, education centers like your mathnasiums and things like that. And then, of course, the gas station / hotel motel combination. That's always a very popular one for a lot of our clients, depending on their background in terms of what they're accustomed to and what they feel familiar with. And so the structure for each of those, obviously, as you know, is always different.
And in terms of like setting up for success, how much do you want to see invested where it's gone into the business, whether it's a startup and they've paid certain vendors, or if it's an acquisition that they've already committed those funds?
So I tend to ask my clients to show an investment of 100,000. They don't have to have spent all of it.
Okay.
But I want to try to get to 100,000 in escrow.
All right.
Right. And then again, depending on what it is that they're doing, I will try and bolster that, saying, well, there's money in case we need to make an additional investment. So, for example, for one of the gas station / convenience stores that we did recently, the investment itself wasn't terribly high. I think it was 75,000 actually. But there was a promissory note for 300,000 for the fuel, right? And that was contractual because they had to sign an 8-year contract.
Wow.
So there was that. And then there was all of the vendor contracts for your chips and your sodas and whatever. And so I included all of that as a part of the startup cost to show that they had met that threshold. And so I just do it based on whatever type it is to try to see what makes
sense for the business at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And have you seen many cases where there's multiple foreign nationals all getting the E-2 visa in the same business?
Yes, but then again, USCIS and the consulates tend not to favor that, because then you run into that regulatory language that USCIS understands to mean 51% ownership, right? And so anytime you have two owners, and I have had this where we've had two owners and I've given each 50%, Then we ended up with a request for evidence saying, well, who has control? And so then we literally had to sort of split it between the two, saying, well, they each have 50%. One is operational, one is financial. So they each have control within their respective verticals, right? So having multiple members, I think just consulates tend to not like it. And again, you know this, consulates are different, right? I mean, you'd send a case like that to a consulate that's very used to it, like Singapore, you'll come out with a very different adjudication than you would out of like Pakistan or Sri Lanka, right? It's all over the place. So structuring this in terms of like knowing what consulate the client's going to go to, what the vertical is that they're investing in. I'm a big proponent of E2s not being like a cut, copy, paste situation, like you really have to work from the ground level and build it up for that specific vertical and that specific consulate.
Yeah, and we were talking offline before, right? We hit the live, but it sounds like it's pretty similar with the O1 visa and a lot of these visa categories that you work with, where it's really quite customized.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, I think the franchise, and I work with investors from, let's say, MENA and South Asia who are very, very familiar with being entrepreneurs. And so they want to do, business from the ground up themselves. And I always caution them. And I've always said, I think my preference is franchise for the simple reason that business is done very, very differently in the US compared to MENA and Asia, right?
Sure.
And you're required to invest a substantial amount, which has never been defined by regulation. But then there's also part two, right? Once you make the investment and you're running the business, your income cannot be marginal, right? So in terms of understanding how business is done and how business is operated, what works in the US or what worked for you in Asia and MENA or Africa or wherever may not necessarily work in the US because it's a completely different culture, completely different business mindset, right? So I think having a franchise is humongously helpful, at least for my clients, because they at least get some form of training and support as they start out. And again, my clients initially will, they'll start with one and then they'll go off into different directions.
And it's much more compliant in terms of there's a franchisor generally collecting royalties, point of sale software, where we've investigated small businesses like, for example, nail salons, where it's a cash business. Mm-hmm. The employees are paid in cash. There's no record. The owner takes out a lot of money from the business, no tax returns. And that's kind of the modus operandi, sadly, for that subset. Where a lot of the world, that is, if it's a small family business, it's kind of run a bit like that nail salon, where it violates IRS, as well as it's not good for the visa. You should be showing that you're making money and you're paying Americans.
Right. And again, I think there's, I'll come back to this. Structuring it also is important because you want to know what the end goal is for the client, right? Like most of my Canadians, for example, they want to come to the US, ideally set up a business here, work and live here maybe for the next 10 to 15 years. Ultimately, they want to retire in Canada. They don't want to be subject to global taxation, so they don't want the green card, right? So then the sort of businesses I would recommend for them is very different from somebody who's investing in an E2 with the intention of making additional cash infusions to then hopefully qualify for an EB-5. Right. It's a super interesting facet of immigration, really, because, you live this day in and day out, right? But no two cases are the same ever. And there's always like some little kink that comes in, which you go down a rabbit hole on, and it's fascinating to try to figure out.
Have you had any like multiple families where one gets the E2 visa investor category and then others get the manager category or essential employee?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that process and how to kind of set it up for success, knowing that maybe there's a matriarch or patriarch that's going to be the first one, and then hopefully there will be other
Yeah,
family
strange you
members.
say that, because that's precisely my case, actually. So we have a client that has bought a fairly large range of businesses, let's say, but they're all in the same space, right? So it's basically a strip mall in Kansas off of the highway.
Okay.
But there's a gas station, and then a 50-room motel, and then a restaurant, and then office space, all in the same space, right? Now, what they're doing with the office space, obviously post-COVID, not much use happening there. So they've decided to convert that into a banquet hall, right? So like banquet facilities. The daughter, who is in the home country, has a degree in hotel management and hospitality, and has been handling the father's banquet business in the home country, right? So we have documentation to show her education, her work experience, reviews from clients that have been posted on online forums, and, like thank you notes that she's received for work that she did in the past. So we've brought her in as an essential employee to manage the banquet side of it. The younger son was in culinary school. And so now he's coming in as an essential employee chef to manage the restaurant. Right? But all of this is with the father as the principal investor.
That's great. So you have 3 nuclear families that are essentially coming to the U.S.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit of the basically going to green card, E2 to EB-5, which is a popular path, especially for folks now that were born in India, where there's not many green card opportunities available. Maybe they got a second citizenship. What's the best way to structure that investment from the beginning to make it as easy as possible from an immigration standpoint to transition to the EB-5?
So this one, the one in Kansas, in particular, I'll use that as an example. We set that up using essentially the same name as the entity in the home country. And then we set up the US entity as a subsidiary of the parent entity, right? And the idea behind doing that is that once we have enough income generation and employment generation in the US, and actually he bought that entity, so he has retained 10 jobs. So then we're going to decide whether EB-5 makes sense or an EB-1C as an international executive, because now we have that affiliation between the two entities. Right, so that's an option. The affiliation and then EB-1C sometimes tends to be a smoother route, only because there's less financial output required, right? Because going from E2 to EB-5, there are several sort of markers that you have to hit on that path, right? Immigration has taken the stand that you cannot reinvest profits. It has to be an infusion every time, right? So then we have to show income, dividends coming out. And that's an issue because now you're claiming dividends, which means you're claiming income, which means you have a higher tax burden. But then you're putting the money back in. Right. So then there's that, like you have to make sure that we're able to show a cash infusion as opposed to reinvestment of profits. And then if it's in a TEA, we have to make sure that it is a TEA for the entire 3 to 5 year period, however long it took for you to now hit 800,000 if you are in a TEA or 1.05 if you are outside of it. Right. So that tract has to qualify every single year that you made the cash infusion. So there are all of these markers that have to sort of line up in order for you to make that shift.
And how long do you need to keep the business? Because from what I saw, I-526 adjudication could be like 4 or 5 years. And then to remove the conditions, I don't know, another 2 or 3 years. So we're looking at 8 years. Do you have to keep the business the whole time, or is it just a certain part of that period?
No, it's a certain part of that period. So right now, if you are starting the journey now, right? Let's say that you're starting the journey now under the Reform and Integrity Act, which we got in March of last year, you are now legally eligible to receive your funds back in 2 years. So the sustainment period is down to 2 years, whereas it used to be 5 years pre-RIA. right? The issue is still going to be with adjudication. So anybody that tried to do this shift and had applications filed pre-October 2022, they are currently in a 5-year waiting period because USCIS is taking so long to adjudicate the I-526s. You know, I've taken to filing several mandamus actions against USCIS on I-526s. So I think I'm up to like 10 mandamus cases, and we've gotten all of them approved.
When do you usually file those? Like after waiting 3 or 4 years?
24 months.
24 months. Oh,
Yeah. Once I cross 24 months, I'm advising clients to file.
And then when do you get the answer from the government?
60 days.
Okay.
Yeah. 60 days later, they'll come back. So assistant U.S. attorneys always try to do a summary judgment to get it thrown out as a first step, right? Once we get past that, it's like, all right, let's try to negotiate this. Would you withdraw if we were to give you a response within 60 days? Right? And that response may be an RFE, but at least I have movement.
You have something.
Right? I have something. It's not like a black hole. Nobody knows where it is.
The client's just not emailing you, calling you, saying, hey, I thought it was going to be a year.
Yeah.
It's now been 2+ years.
Yeah. So right now, with at least the clients that are trying to make that switch now, we're looking at processing times now. Right. So there's just been a EB-5 I-526 for a rural project, rural area, that was approved in 11 months. And this was earlier this month. So it looks like, at least if you are trying to make that shift and you're filing based on you being in a rural area, you're no longer looking at that, you know, ridiculously long wait. And then again,
they're processing that queue faster.
Yeah, they're processing that queue a lot faster.
And that's what you're seeing from your client base as well as other immigration attorney colleagues?
Yes. Yeah.
And how about expedited processing? Because we have clients looking actively for E2/EB-5 eligible businesses that are in healthcare, are in STEM education. Do you see that as a viable path?
Yes. I mean, there are rumors. I haven't clarified. I haven't received confirmation. There are rumors of certain EB-5 projects that are expecting, I believe, I don't believe they've received it yet, expecting approvals within 6 months. And this is true for adult care facilities. And then also there's one specific one, which is a drug rehabilitation center.
Okay.
So I know that they are expecting to get I-526s approved pretty quickly. I haven't seen that actually happen, but there are certain industries that are, you know, classified as critical. I mean, like there's infrastructure is one of the 3 that qualifies for reserved visas under EB-5, but I'm not recommending any infrastructure projects because we don't know what qualifies, honestly, right? Immigration hasn't provided that bit of information. So I think for applicants going from E2 to EB-5, right, again, project selection or franchise selection, I think is crucial. I think it's a lot harder, for example, to go from ownership of a singular gas station to EB-5. I don't see how that would be successful, right? Because you don't need 10 full-time jobs for a single.
My favorite right now is staffing, like a staffing agency, caregivers.
Yeah.
Because the investment threshold's not that high. You can start as low as 100K, but you know, you can own the real estate or you can inject further capital. And after 3 or 4 years, you have 40 to 50 plus employees, most of which are full-time.
Yeah. Yeah. I also have one individual right now, and he's had it for a long time, but he's up in almost near the Canadian border. I think he's like 15 miles south of the Canadian border. So it's a rural area, but he's been on an E2 for 10 years. But over the last 10 years, cash infusion has happened. Problem is, it's been reinvestment of the profits. Right. And so we've had to basically go back and like figure out his dividends and have him essentially take a
refile taxes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how about going EB-2 NIW? Because that's been a much more frequent transition for our E2 visa clients over the last, I would say, 3 years, where the principal applicant or the spouse gets the green card through the EB-2 NIW.
Yeah, that is an option. I mean, and that's something that, would work. My only concern right now, again, is the EB-2 perm half of it, not the national interest waiver, but the perm half of the processing is currently taking us about a year, right? It used to be 3 months. Department of Labor right now has a massive backlog. And so that, I think, affects the equation. But then again, going back to your staffing industry, if it's somebody that's doing an EB-2 NIW with a background in STEM, right? The US has a new policy on NIW, STEM-based NIWs, where they don't require like the Nobel Peace Prize or whatever USCS likes to see, right? But there are there's relaxed criteria for
We've
STEM
seen that with our engineer clients. Yeah, basically anyone in the STEM space, it definitely seems easier.
So anybody in the STEM space, I think, for them to do the NIW EB-2 option would be great. But again, country of birth is a factor, right? So if you've got somebody from India wanting to come in on an E2 via Grenada and then do an EB-2 NIW, doesn't help because there are no visas, because it's still an EB-2.
What do you see? Do you see any hope for Indian-born nationals, like over the next 5 years in terms of legislative or regulatory changes?
I think so. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be thanks to Canada, really, right? So like that recent...
Canada's a big push, trying to take our talent, tech talent on H-1B visas.
Right. But that ran out in 36 hours. 36 hours. That's all it took.
I didn't hear that. That's wild.
Right, for that to run out. And so I think I'm hoping, perhaps a little too optimistic, but at least from what we're hearing, like that's really lit a fire under Congress saying, okay, we've got to figure this out. And so I'm hoping that is the impetus to doing something. But for the moment, again, I think E2 to EB-5 is a great option for Indian nationals, or for those born in India specifically. I mean, obviously, direct to EB-5 is always an option, but, that's easier said than done. You're having to dole out $900,000. That's not...
Yeah, we've seen
change.
We've seen people get quite creative with like family members and donations or loans to make that happen.
Yeah, and then for the E2, India and China born that opted for CBI and RBI, I think they do need to be careful there, right? Like, I mean, before the call, we were just talking about a bunch of developers in Grenada that have been decertified for failure to complete projects. And it looks like Grenada is really clamping down on developers primarily because they don't want to get thrown out of access to the EU, because that's their biggest selling point, right? So they're having to take a much harder stance.
The E2 treaty too, potentially.
Yeah.
And I think the title of our conversation today, setting your E2 visa application up for success, there's like the immigration component, but also the business side where it's like matching the profile. So like we had a professor and he invested in a STEM education franchise, and that opens them up to potentially go up to EB-2 NIW or go to the EB-5 path. And I think it's key kind of always keeping your doors open if you want to get a green card one day, because like you said, many Canadians don't. We have a lot of Americans that don't. They just want to spend some time in the US, and that's fine. But if you think there's a chance for a green card, really keep your options open. And I think on the business structure side, as well as what industry you're in, it might make it easier to create those jobs or get that EB-2 NIW down the line after a few years on the E2.
Yeah, and then again, some consulates are a lot more particular about the investor's experience because, again, they're looking at that investor's ability to fulfill the regulatory requirement to be in control and develop and direct the enterprise, right? And so I think, again, who the investor is, if you're working with a couple, and let's say the spouse has more opportunities and possible potential for doing the EB-2 NIW route, you don't want that spouse to be the investor on the E2. But you may not have an option if the other spouse doesn't have the qualifications to be able to fulfill
might
that.
not be able to get to the US in the first place.
Yeah. So I know like that issue about the ability to develop and direct the enterprise, that's something that I know Singapore, South Korea, and now increasingly UAE is very, very focused on. Because again, the UAE is a hub for people from, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, everybody is there. And that's something that they're really looking into. And then also source of funds. And I think source of funds now, I'm seeing issues obviously with Russians because there's sanctions and potential OFAC issues over there. But source of funds is becoming a big issue in E2s.
And before 2023, I'd never heard of this or never saw it as an issue, where it was just showing that you have control of those funds, and it was your ability to invest those funds, but not going to like EB-5 and it's like, where exactly are you getting this money?
And that's increasingly what is now happening, right? We're having to do similar level of financial audit, if you will, for an E2 source of funds narrative that I would do for an EB-5 case. And I think for countries that have currency restrictions, foreign exchange remittance restrictions, like all of that needs to be taken into consideration, because those are just issues that either the consulate or immigration is going to pull up.
Kripa, we have a few questions that I'd like to ask. I'd like to show on the screen here. The first one's from Sophia. Hi, are loans or gifts valid sources for E2 investment?
Yes, absolutely. Gifts, typically you will need just a gift deed from whoever the giftor is, identifying him or herself as the giftor and that it is a gift, right? So there needs to be language there which basically says this is a gift, I no longer have any claim to it. And then you could do a loan. Again, they don't need to be secured by collateral that you own to be perfectly safe. If you have the collateral, do that. But loans do not have to be secured by collateral. But it can be both. It can be a loan or a gift or either one.
And then we have one from Lucas. Hello, could you talk about the first steps to prep investment and funds for the E2 visa?
So I think the first thing, again, like we've talked about, is deciding what your long-term goals are, right? The E2 visa can be problematic depending on your country of origin, your country of citizenship, because of the reciprocity. So US will only allow you the maximum amount of time that your country of citizenship would allow somebody from the US going there, right? And so much of Europe and South America, you get 5 years. But if you're, like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, I think you're down to like 90 days. And so you really want to keep those things in mind, right? What country is your citizenship from? What is the reciprocity that you're going to get? Because then you have that as a basis to determine how much time you're going to have to show that you have actually created jobs or that you've earned enough income to be able to get extensions. Because at base, right, irrespective of where you're from, at minimum, you're needing to renew your E2 every 4.5 years. And whether you do that inside the US or whether you do that outside via the consulate, all of those are things you really want to take into consideration before you fund your E2 visa.
Kripa, this just came to mind. Over the last few years, we've had denials from E2 visa investors applying in countries like Egypt and Pakistan for the intent to return to their home country. How can people set their application up for success and prove that they plan to come back home?
So again, certain consulates are going above and beyond, right? Historically, nothing more, regulatory speaking at least, nothing more has been required of investors other than a statement to say that they understand that an E2 is a non-immigrant intent and they intend to return home. Essentially, that's what's been required for the longest time. Now, what consulates are looking at is, do you have a business? Have you already sold your home? Have you essentially, closed out your bank accounts before you even get to the US? And so that's something I think attorneys and agents need to counsel clients on, is to obviously not do that before you have your visa issued. And then understand that the E2 is a non-immigrant intent application. And so again, if you are planning on coming into the US on an E2, 2 or 3 years later, you decide you want to do the 2 or 3 years later, you decide you want to do the EB-5 or the I-140, then timing of when you file that application is super crucial, because you cannot show So for example, you can't have an I-140 filed with USCIS and then simultaneously ask for an extension on your E2, right? You've shown immigrant intent. You're no longer eligible for E2. So I think understanding all of those at the front end, at least for me, that's what I spend a lot of my time on. Initial calls is essentially going through play-by-play of, the next 3 years and where are you likely to be, so we know how to set this up for you.
Kripa, do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah, of course.
So we have from Tomas, can applicants modify their investment structure later?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by investment structure, but generally speaking, yes. You can expand into other areas as well, right? So let's say you start with, I don't know, a gas station, and you later decide to invest in a restaurant. You can do that. My caution on that would be that you obviously work with an attorney because of liability issue, right? So for example, I have one client right now where he started with a logistics company. He's now added 3 gas stations and a realty business, right? The thought initially was to set up a holding company, a parent company, that would then hold 100% of each of these LLCs.
Yeah.
Problem is, each of these LLCs are high liability, right? So having all of them feed into a holding company, you get one lawsuit, the entire house of cards comes tumbling down. Right? So I think you have to look into all of these things. So can you modify your investment structure? Absolutely. But then you also want to look at it from a liability standpoint and state law standpoint in terms of what would work best for you.
And we have a question from Essie. Hey, Patrick, does the new US E2 ruling distinguish between your E2 investment being a donation or an investment? I imagine like a real estate investment.
I don't know that we've seen any specific guidance from immigration yet on the donation piece. At least I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, I don't think they updated the FAM, the Foreign Affairs Manual in May, and there was no mention of it.
Nothing. So, yeah, sorry, I don't have any information on this yet because I haven't seen anything come through from the government on this.
And Kripa, what's the best way for people to contact you? Do you do initial consultations?
Yes, yeah, we do initial consultations. Best way would be to just send me an email, and you can do that via the Karr Tuttle Campbell website. I also have WhatsApp because most of my clients are outside of the country, and so Zoom, WhatsApp, email, whatever works. More than happy to help you set up.
So yeah, we put the website on karrtuttle.com. For anyone listening, if you're interested in having a consultation with Kripa, and she definitely goes above and beyond, and it's not just getting you the visa now, but like she said, what's your plan 3 years, 5 years, 7 years from now?
Yeah, because again, like I said, the getting the first one is just step one, right? Like you still have to make sure you're going to be able to get it renewed 2 to 5 years down the line.
So you take care of the immigration side, so the clients can focus on creating their empire of all different types of businesses, as well as focus on their family.
Yeah.
Awesome, Kripa. Thanks a lot. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure all our listeners did as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you and your team. So thank you very much.
My team for the same in all the cases.
Thank you.